October 14, 1943. 25,000 feet above central Germany, the sky was already crowded before the first shots were fired. Long silver streams of B-17 flying fortresses cut through the thin autumn air, their contrails stretching across the horizon like chalk lines drawn over the Reich. Below them, German cities prepared for impact. Factories continued working. Sirens waited. Above them something new was happening. For 4 years, the Luftwaffe had owned the European sky. From Poland to France, from the English Channel to the vast distances of Russia, German fighter pilots had operated with confidence. They climbed when they chose to climb. They attacked when they chose to attack. Even in defensive operations over the Reich, they believed altitude and initiative remained theirs. But on this morning the Americans were not merely passing through, they were arriving with intent. The bomber stream that day was large, but it was not unprecedented. What unsettled German observers was the escort. American fighters, disciplined, climbing deliberately above the bomber formations, were no longer staying close to the coast, they were pushing deeper. Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II studied the approaching formations through binoculars from his airfield. He had fought Spitfires over France. He had developed head-on attack tactics against heavy bombers. He understood how to disrupt formations, but this felt different. The American escort fighters were not flying defensively. They were positioning aggressively, above the bombers, not merely beside them. For the first time in the air war over Germany, the Luftwaffe would not dictate altitude. The intercept order came quickly. Messerschmitt Bf-199s and Falk Luft-19s scrambled from airfields across central Germany. Engines roared. Pilots climbed hard, seeking to gain advantage before the bomber stream crossed critical industrial targets. For years, this sequence had been familiar. Climb, intercept, strike bombers, disengage, repeat. But when German fighters reached engagement altitude that day, they encountered resistance immediately. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were not waiting passively. They dove. Not recklessly, but deliberately, in coordinated formations. German pilots attempting to climb into firing position against the bombers found themselves attacked from above before they could stabilize their aim. Diving American fighters carried enormous speed. Heavy machine gun fire cut through the thin air. Tracers converged. Several Luftwaffe pilots broke formation instinctively to evade. And in that moment, something subtle but critical occurred. The Luftwaffe reacted instead of initiating. The German doctrine of the early war years had relied on seizing initiative, striking first, maintaining energy advantage, forcing the enemy to respond. But now, over their own territory, they were encountering an escort force willing to contest altitude aggressively. The Americans had learned. Earlier in 1943, bomber raids into Germany had been devastatingly costly. Without deep escort coverage, formations suffered severe losses to concentrated German fighter attacks. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions had demonstrated the limits of unescorted daylight bombing, but American industry did not retreat. It adapted. Improved drop tanks extended fighter range. Tactics shifted. Escort fighters were no longer chained tightly to bomber wings. They were released to sweep ahead, clear airspace, and challenge German interceptors before bomber contact. The sky over Germany was becoming layered. That October day, as engagements multiplied across altitude bands, German pilots began noticing another shift. American fighters were not easily driven off. Previously, German interceptors could often rely on limited fuel endurance of Allied escorts. If they survived initial clashes, they could resume bomber attacks once the escorts turned back. Now, escorts lingered longer. Fuel calculations grew uncertain. Combat reports later noted increasing difficulty in isolating bomber formations from their protective screens. German fighters attempting coordinated mass attacks found their assembly disrupted by aggressive American dives. Losses mounted incrementally, not catastrophic in a single instant, but steady. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous. Its pilots were experienced. They inflicted losses that day. Bombers fell in flames. Parachutes opened over hostile ground. But the pattern had shifted. For the first time, German fighters faced sustained escort presence deep inside the Reich. Control of altitude, once assumed, became contested. And when altitude is contested, confidence erodes. At ground level, observers saw only contrails and distant flashes. But in the cockpits, pilots sensed it clearly. The sky no longer felt exclusively theirs, it felt crowded, and competition in air warfare is rarely stable. Once altitude advantage becomes uncertain, every engagement becomes riskier. Every climb demands calculation, every dive carries potential exposure. By the end of October 14th, losses on both sides were sobering. The Americans would remember the mission for its heavy bomber casualties. The Germans would note tactical successes against unescorted elements. But beneath the statistics lay a more profound development. The Americans had proven they were willing and increasingly able to challenge Luftwaffe control directly over Germany itself. The change was not complete. But it had begun, and once begun, it would not reverse. The sky over northern Germany filled before dawn. This time it was not a single raid, not a limited strike meant to test defenses. It was something larger, coordinated, sustained, deliberate. The Allies called it Big Week. Its objective was not merely to damage factories. It was to force the Luftwaffe into the air and break it there. Aircraft production facilities across the Reich, Augsburg, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Leipzig, were marked for destruction. The Germans understood immediately what was at stake. If aircraft factories were crippled and fighter strength reduced simultaneously, the Reich's defensive shield would thin permanently. The order went out: intercept everything. Hundreds of German fighters rose over successive days. Veterans led formations of increasingly younger wingmen. Fuel allocations were stretched. Maintenance crews worked through freezing nights to keep engines operational. Every available aircraft that could climb was committed. But the Americans had prepared carefully. By early 1944, the long-range escort problem had been largely solved. Drop tanks extended fighter endurance dramatically. The P-51 Mustang now entered combat in meaningful numbers, complementing P-47 Thunderbolts that had refined high-altitude escort tactics over the previous year. The change was not only in hardware, it was doctrinal. Escort fighters were no longer restricted to close protective orbits around bomber boxes. They were given authority to roam ahead of formations, to sweep intercept routes, to disrupt assembly points, to attack German fighters before they reached optimal attack positions. The sky became a contested field rather than a corridor. On the morning of February 20th, German fighter units attempting to organize massed interception waves found American escorts already present at altitude. Climb routes were harassed, rendezvous patterns were broken. Some German formations were forced into defensive maneuvers before even reaching bomber altitude. This was new. Previously, the Luftwaffe could calculate timing precisely, climb from designated airfields, assemble at prearranged coordinates, then strike the bomber stream in coordinated passes. Now American fighters were intruding into that preparation space. They were hunting the hunters. The effect was cumulative. In air combat, organization is fragile. A formation disrupted early often enters engagement fragmented. Pilots separated from their leaders must choose between regrouping or attacking opportunistically. Discipline erodes under pressure. During Big Week, German fighters repeatedly encountered escort resistance before achieving stable firing positions against bombers. American pilots, now experienced and confident in energy tactics, dove aggressively when German aircraft appeared below. They climbed methodically when threatened from beneath. Vertical maneuver became routine. Reports from Luftwaffe units during these days reflected mounting strain. Losses were not only aircraft, they were men. Experienced Staffelkapitän squadron leaders who had survived campaigns in Poland, France, Britain, and Russia were killed or wounded. Replacement pilots, already limited in training hours due to fuel shortages, were thrust into intense engagements against seasoned Allied aviators. American industry ensured that lost fighters were replaced quickly. Pilot training pipelines in the United States produced thousands of new aircrew annually. Though not all were veterans, they entered combat with substantial flight hours and structured formation training. Germany could not match that scale by 1944. Fuel scarcity forced reductions in training time. Some replacement pilots entered combat with barely 100 total flight hours, a fraction of what earlier Luftwaffe aces had accumulated before seeing action. Skill disparity began widening. During a week-long offensive, German aircraft losses were significant. While bomber casualties remained painful for the Allies, the strategic goal was being achieved. The Luftwaffe was being drawn into repeated engagements under unfavorable conditions. Factories were bombed. Airfields were strafed, infrastructure was hit repeatedly. But more critically, fighter strength was being drained. By the end of Big Week, German aircraft production facilities had suffered disruption, though not complete destruction, yet the greater damage lay elsewhere, in attrition among experienced fighter units. The Luftwaffe had been forced to commit heavily, and commitment under sustained pressure without adequate replacement is a path toward erosion. The sky over Germany began to feel thinner, not empty, but less confidently controlled. American fighter sweeps grew more frequent in the weeks that followed. Instead of merely escorting bombers, Allied fighters began conducting aggressive patrols deep into German airspace. Airfields were attacked directly. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Fuel depots were targeted. The strategic equation shifted from defense to survival. German pilots who once measured success by bomber kills increasingly found themselves fighting to maintain operational viability. Aircraft shortages were compounded by fuel constraints. Even intact fighters sometimes sat grounded due to limited allocations. Meanwhile, American escorts lingered longer and penetrated deeper. Altitude dominance, once intermittent, became routine. The combination of P-47s at high altitude and P-51s with extended range created overlapping coverage. German fighters could no longer rely on predictable escort withdrawal. Engagements occurred earlier and lasted longer. The psychological effect intensified. For years, the Luftwaffe had been regarded by friend and foe alike as one of the most formidable air forces in the world. Its early war successes had shaped the image of German military superiority. But air superiority is not static. It depends on training, logistics, fuel, coordination, and numerical balance. Big Week exposed cracks in that structure. The Luftwaffe was still capable of inflicting damage. It remained dangerous, but its margin for error shrank rapidly. Every experienced pilot lost was difficult to replace. Every airfield cratered required repair resources that were increasingly scarce. Every escort that returned unchallenged represented a small shift in the balance of power. The Allies were not merely defending bomber formations anymore. They were contesting the sky itself. And by the spring of 1944, the outcome of that contest was becoming increasingly clear. The Luftwaffe had not collapsed, but it was no longer dictating terms. Control was slipping, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in steady, measurable increments. And once control of the sky begins to fragment, regaining it requires resources Germany no longer possessed. The day the Luftwaffe lost the sky was not a single date circled on a calendar. But during Big Week, the tipping point became visible. Before the first Allied soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, the sky had already been decided. In the early hours before dawn, the English Channel filled with ships, thousands of vessels moving in coordinated silence toward the French coast. Above them, transport aircraft carried airborne divisions inland. Naval guns prepared to open fire, but the most decisive layer of the invasion was not on the water. It was overhead. For months leading up to D-Day, the Allied air campaign had intensified. Rail lines were severed, bridges were destroyed, fuel depots were bombed. Airfields across northern France were systematically attacked to reduce German fighter response capacity. The goal was simple. When the invasion came, the Luftwaffe would be unable to contest it meaningfully. At first light on June 6, that goal became reality. Allied aircraft blanketed the sky in staggering numbers. Fighters patrolled at multiple altitudes. Medium bombers struck defensive positions. Heavy bombers targeted inland infrastructure. Fighter bombers roamed transportation routes to prevent reinforcement. German radar stations detected the scale of activity immediately. Reports flooded command posts. But response options were limited. Aircraft were available, though fewer than in earlier years. Pilots were available, though many were inexperienced. Fuel was available, but rationed carefully. And the sky above Normandy was already saturated. German fighter units that managed to scramble faced overwhelming numerical disparity. In some sectors, Allied aircraft outnumbered Luftwaffe fighters by ratios exceeding 10-1. Attempting to climb into position often meant being intercepted almost immediately. Altitude, the foundation of air superiority, was gone. Allied fighters operated from the Channel up to high-altitude layers with structured patrol patterns. Radar coordination, radio discipline, and numerical redundancy ensured that German aircraft were detected and engaged quickly. The Luftwaffe did not vanish entirely on D-Day. Isolated attacks occurred. Individual German pilots flew courageous missions against invasion shipping and ground forces. A few bombs were dropped, some aircraft were shot down, but the scale was negligible compared to the operation unfolding below. For the first time in the war, a major European amphibious invasion proceeded without meaningful air interference from Germany. That fact alone marked a decisive strategic shift. In 1940, German air power had paralyzed Allied movements in France. In 1941, the Luftwaffe had provided devastating support to blitzkrieg advances. Even during defensive phases, German fighters had maintained the ability to challenge enemy airspace aggressively. Now, over their own occupied territory, they were largely absent. The consequences rippled outward immediately. Without air cover, German ground forces moved cautiously, often only at night. Daytime movement risked detection and attack by Allied fighter bombers. Convoys attempting to reach Normandy from deeper within France were harassed continuously. Bridges destroyed earlier in the campaign slowed reinforcement. Rail networks were in disarray. The sky had become an operational weapon. Allied ground commanders understood this fully. Armored units advancing from the beaches coordinated closely with tactical air support. Requests for airstrikes could be processed rapidly. When German armored concentrations were detected, they were often engaged from above before committing fully to battle. For German units, uncertainty dominated. Moving by day invited air attack. Moving by night slowed coordination and logistics. Fuel shortages compounded the difficulty. Panthers and Tigers, powerful in defensive engagements, struggled to redeploy quickly across damaged infrastructure under constant aerial threat. The Luftwaffe attempted counterattacks in the weeks following D-Day. Small formations struck shipping or ground targets, but each sortie risked heavy losses. Allied fighters patrolled aggressively, intercepting German aircraft before they could concentrate effectively. By mid-June 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Allied air forces did not merely dominate during specific engagements. They maintained persistent presence, and persistence reshapes war. German soldiers on the ground coined terms for Allied fighter bombers that roamed roads and fields. The sound of approaching aircraft engines became synonymous with disruption. Even rumors of air patrols altered movement patterns. The absence of Luftwaffe cover was felt as much psychologically as physically. Pilots who had once climbed confidently over France now faced an inverted reality. They launched into skies where the enemy was already positioned above them. They climbed through contrails that marked layered patrol grids. They engaged opponents backed by numerical superiority and logistical depth. Air combat requires initiative. Initiative requires freedom of maneuver. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had little of either in Western Europe. The cumulative attrition from 1943 and early 1944 accelerated during Big Week, now manifested fully. Experienced leaders were gone. Training pipelines were constrained. Fuel shortages limited both operational sorties and preparation. Allied aircraft production, by contrast, continued expanding. The skies over Normandy symbolized more than a localized imbalance. They represented systemic displacement. The Luftwaffe was still formidable on the Eastern Front in certain sectors. It still possessed capable aircraft designs, but in the West, it had lost the strategic contest for altitude and numbers. And once altitude is surrendered, ground operations become exposed. The invasion of Normandy succeeded not solely because of ground bravery or naval firepower. It succeeded because the sky above the battlefield belonged to the Allies. German commanders recognized this grimly in after-action assessments. Reinforcement delays, communication breakdowns, and vulnerability to air attack were cited repeatedly as decisive factors limiting counteroffensive potential. The Luftwaffe had not been destroyed in a single climactic battle. It had been displaced. On June 6, 1944, the world saw the result. The day the Luftwaffe lost the sky was no longer theoretical. It was visible above the beaches of Normandy. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe still existed. Aircraft remained in hangars. Pilots still wore flight jackets and climbed into cockpits. Engines still started. But the force that had once dominated Europe's skies was now fighting for survival. The final proof came on January 1, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte. It was conceived as a desperate gamble. Nearly 900 German fighters were ordered to launch low-level surprise attacks against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. The objective was bold: destroy Allied aircraft on the ground, shatter tactical air superiority, and buy time for German forces engaged in the Ardennes offensive. At first light, German aircraft crossed the front lines at treetop height. Surprise was achieved in several sectors. Allied airfields were caught in moments of reduced alertness. Aircraft burned on the ground. Hangars were strafed. For a brief window, it appeared that the Luftwaffe had struck a meaningful blow. But the cost was catastrophic. Navigation errors led to friendly anti-aircraft fire claiming German aircraft before they even reached targets. Communication failures scattered formations. Many pilots, poorly trained replacements rushed into combat, lacked the experience required for complex low-level coordinated attacks. Even where tactical success was achieved, escape proved deadly. Allied anti-aircraft defenses recovered quickly. Fighter patrols launched in response. German aircraft attempting to return across front lines were intercepted. When the operation ended, the numbers told the story. While the Allies replaced damaged aircraft rapidly, Germany had lost hundreds of fighters and, more critically, experienced pilots it could not afford to lose. Bodenplatte was the last large-scale offensive effort of the Luftwaffe in the West. It failed not because courage was absent, but because the system sustaining the force had eroded beyond recovery. Fuel shortages had become crippling by early 1945. Training flights were drastically reduced. Replacement pilots often entered combat with minimal hours in type. Some had never practiced complex formation maneuvers under real conditions. Meanwhile, Allied fighters roamed almost without challenge. Long-range escort fighters now operated freely over central and western Germany. Fighter bombers attacked rail yards, bridges, and retreating columns daily. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Aircraft destroyed on the ground could not be replaced at meaningful rates. The skies over Germany, once protected by confident interceptor formations, became open corridors for Allied operations. German commanders recognized the shift. Reports from early 1945 describe aircraft shortages compounded by maintenance delays and fuel rationing. Even advanced designs like the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, technologically impressive and capable of high speed, were deployed too late and in insufficient numbers to reverse the situation. Jets required fuel, trained pilots, and stable infrastructure. Germany had none in abundance. Even when Me-260 achieved isolated successes against bomber formations, they operated under constant threat from Allied fighters targeting takeoff and landing phases. Airfields were attacked preemptively. The jets could not sustain continuous presence. Air superiority is not achieved by isolated technological advantage. It is sustained by logistics, training, and numbers. By March 1945, Allied aircraft operated in daylight across vast stretches of Germany with limited organized opposition. Ground forces advancing from west and east coordinated seamlessly with air support. Bridges were struck before demolition. Columns were identified and attacked. Retreat routes were choked with bomb damage. German soldiers increasingly described Allied aircraft as ever-present. The psychological toll mirrored the operational reality. Young Luftwaffe pilots entered combat knowing they faced opponents often more experienced and numerically superior. They climbed into skies layered with enemy patrols. They engaged in brief, violent encounters that often ended swiftly. Loss rates remained unsustainable, and losses in 1945 were not simply aircraft, they were the final remnants of institutional experience. By April, many Luftwaffe units existed more on paper than in practical combat strength. Aircraft lacking fuel sat idle. Pilots lacking hours awaited missions that rarely materialized. Airfields were cratered or overrun. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced deeper into Germany, the sky overhead offered little resistance. The collapse was not theatrical. There was no singular duel that symbolized the end. Instead, there was absence. Where once German fighters had risen in disciplined waves to intercept bomber streams, now only scattered aircraft appeared sporadically. Where once altitude advantage had been carefully calculated, now Allied fighters patrolled unchallenged. The Luftwaffe had lost the sky not because its aircraft designs were inherently inferior, nor because its pilots lacked bravery. It lost the sky because it could not sustain the war of attrition imposed upon it. Industrial output could not match ally production. Fuel reserves could not support training and operations simultaneously. Experienced pilots could not be replaced quickly enough to offset combat losses. The tipping point had begun in 1943. It became visible during Big Week in 1944. It was undeniable over Normandy. And by 1945 it was irreversible. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe that had once symbolized blitzkrieg dominance was a shadow of its former self. The sky once claimed confidently over Europe had changed hands. The day the Luftwaffe lost the sky was not a single date circled in red. It was a process, a steady erosion of initiative, a gradual surrender of altitude, a widening gap in training, fuel, and numbers, a shift from dominance to defense, and from defense to survival. In the end, the sky belonged to the side that could fill it, sustain it, and defend it continuously. And by 1945, that was no longer Germany. The Luftwaffe did not fall in a dramatic instant. It faded under relentless pressure. And when it was gone, the war below followed soon after.